Let's bring in our US correspondent, Mark Stone, joining us from DC. And as I mentioned there briefly, Mark, President Biden arrives at a time ahead of that NATO leaders meeting where the United States have made what many see as a controversial decision to supply cluster munitions to Ukraine.
Yes, President Biden had said himself that this decision was not an easy one to make. And it's clear from officials I've spoken to here, it's not a decision they wanted to make. But the facts on the ground in Ukraine, on those battlefields in the east of the country, are what they are. And the amount of ammunition, of more conventional artillery that is being used is it's being used at such an extent that it has surprised everyone. There is a sense of stalemate. The Ukrainians' counteroffensive plainly is not going as quickly as people had hoped. That's not to say the Russians are doing any better. They are not. But there is a stalemate there, and the ammunition is running low. And therefore, it has become clear that to bridge that gap, cluster munitions from the Americans need to be part of the weapons package. The other NATO countries, many other NATO countries, have expressed their unease when asked about this decision. Britain, Germany, New Zealand, Canada, others as well are worried about this decision. But they are bound to say that because they're bound by a convention banning the use of cluster munitions, which the Americans never signed. Now, countering that, the Americans have said quite clearly that they believe that their specific cluster munition that they are supplying to the Ukrainians won't be dropped from planes indiscriminately. It will be fired from artillery pieces on the battlefield. It has what's known as a very low dud rate. In other words, the big concern with cluster munitions is that a proportion of the bomblets that are distributed on the area where the munition lands do not explode. Well, the dud rate of the munitions the Americans are supplying is plus or minus 2%. That is low compared to the dud rate of the weapons that the Russians are already using on the battlefield, and the sort of weapons that were used in wars like Yugoslavia. But this weapon, it is controversial. It will cause conversations at NATO, but it is highly effective on the battlefield, and that is where the Ukrainians say it will be used. The onus will be on them to make sure they don't hit civilians and to make sure there isn't a legacy of civilian casualties afterwards. As I say, it is a very effective weapon, and the hope is that it will break the stalemate. It was used back in 1991 in the first Gulf War by the Americans, and the Iraqi military used to say it was like steel rain coming down on their battlefield. So you can get a sense of how effective it is, but also how controversial it is if it is dropped, as the Russians have been doing, in the wrong place.
Absolutely. Mark, for now, thank you for that. Mark Stone there in DC. With the news there that President Biden's jet, Air Force One, begins its taxi, there is some controversy surrounding his arrival in the UK ahead of going on to a NATO leaders summit in Vilnius in Lithuania. We've got our political correspondent Rob Powell standing by as well for some insight into the discussion that will be held tomorrow between President Biden and Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And Rob, this is going to be the 6th meeting between the two men. The last time they met, they announced that Atlantic Declaration with a lot of promises and plans to work more closely together. But as Mark was mentioning there is a bit of tension when the two meet over those cluster munitions.
Yeah, lots of meetings already for these two leaders. As you say, they were at the G7. They were also in Washington when Rishi Sunak flew over there to see Joe Biden last month. They met in San Diego as well to discuss that defence alliance, and in Belfast, of course, to discuss the Good Friday Agreement, the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. Tomorrow morning, there'll be a meeting between Rishi Sunak and Joe Biden in terms of what's expected to be discussed. Well, the pre-briefed remarks from Downing Street suggest an emphasis on that declaration, that agreement that was come to in Washington in the last visit, the Atlantic Declaration, that essentially is a sort of series of mini deals really about cooperation on clean energy, on critical minerals, on artificial intelligence, about strengthening supply chains as well. Number 10, very, very keen, I think, to put that forward as a sign that even though a sort of more formal trade deal appears completely off the table at the moment, they are working to try and strengthen especially trade alliances and cooperation with the US. I think, though, I was listening to an interview with the British ambassador in Washington earlier this weekend, and she described the original hook for this visit from Joe Biden to the UK as actually being an invitation from the King, because, of course, after that meeting tomorrow in Downing Street, Joe Biden will head to Windsor Castle, where he will meet King Charles. He, of course, wasn't at the coronation of King Charles, so this will be the first time that he has met him since he was crowned. And I think discussions there are expected to focus on climate change and Joe Biden's approach to green policies and green tech investment. Clearly for King Charles, that is a massive personal interest and something that in the past, the ambassador said anyway, he had discussed with Joe Biden in the past. We're expecting as well, according to the schedule, the briefing from the White House, that the president will also take part in a climate engagement with the King and also with philanthropists and investors as well. John Kerry, President Biden's envoy for climate, is already in the UK. Giving interviews this morning, he said that he and the Energy Secretary from the UK government, Grant Shapps, were expected to brief the King and the President as well tomorrow in Windsor. So I think a big part of this, yes, the Rishi Sunak meeting, but as you say, there have been several before. I think maybe the sort of prime mover of this trip will be that meeting with the King, where climate is set to take centre stage.
Fascinating, Rob. As we're continuing to look at the door there of Air Force One, which is open, the steps are in place. Some of the officials there preparing the moment for when President Biden does disembark and begins his quick visit, a stopover in the UK before going on to the NATO Leaders Summit. Let's bring back in our US correspondent, Mark Stone, if we can. Mark, as Rob was mentioning there, you know, Biden and Sunak have met 6 times as we see President Biden at the top of the steps, arriving here in the UK. Let's just stay with these pictures a moment before bringing Mark back in. Yeah. President Biden there, down the steps, on his shoulder, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He has been met by the US Ambassador to the United Kingdom, Jane Hartley. President Biden and his team will spend the evening at the Ambassador's residence. That's in Regent's Park. We're told they're going to take Marine One to get there, and that will be taken to the air shortly once President Biden has glad-handed and met all those officials who have arrived at Stansted to meet him. Let's bring Mark Stone back in, our US correspondent. Mark, just picking up on the points that Rob was making there. You know, as we said, President Biden and Prime Minister Sunak have met many times, 6 times. This will be the 6th meeting between the two men, and there was that Atlantic Declaration announced last time they met in DC. So the importance then, I guess, Mark, of his meeting with the King, and the first meeting with the King since King Charles was crowned.
Yes, and we're told that the two men, the King and the President, have a good relationship. They don't know each other all that well, and this, as Rob said, is the first time that the President will have met the King as King. But both men have had long careers. The President has met then Prince Charles many times over his many years as Vice President, as a Senator here in the United States as well. And so there is a relationship there, and there are mutual interests as well, climate change being a key one. And so I think as we see the President board Marine One for that short flight from Stansted to Wingfield House in Regent's Park, one of the focuses will be tomorrow on climate change and on how the two men can marry their interests on climate change, can use their influence on issues of climate change. So that will be a focus tomorrow afternoon. We'll get all the pomp, of course, with the Welsh Guards Guard of Honour at Windsor Castle, in the quadrangle there at Windsor Castle, before a meeting between the King and the President in, I think, the Green Drawing Room of Windsor Castle. Before that, though, there will be the more substantive political discussion with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. This will be the first time that President Biden has been to number 10 Downing Street as President. Of course, he's been there many times before as Vice President, but this is the first time as President. But the Americans and the Brits are quite keen to quash any suggestions that the President is anti-British. There's been a bit of a narrative recently, stemmed, I think, from an American reluctance to want to put forward Ben Wallace, the current UK Defence Secretary, as a potential successor to Jens Stoltenberg at NATO. The Americans were not up for that. That generated some suggestions, along with the President's vibe in Ireland when he visited Ireland, that perhaps he was anti-British. They're trying to do as much as they can to counter that, and are pointing out that the President and the Prime Minister have met 6 times in the last 6 months. They met in San Diego over a deal with submarines with Australia. They met just last month here at the White House. So an awful lot of meetings have taken place between the two sides. They would say that special relationship is certainly special still.
Yeah, they certainly would say that. OK, Mark, for now, thank you very much for that. Our political correspondent, Rob Powell, is still standing by as we're looking there at the helicopter, which has now become Marine One, now that the President is on board. As Mark was saying, it's about to make the short flight from Stansted Airport, just to the east of London, to north-west London, to Regent's Park, to Winfield House, the residence of the US ambassador. And Rob, as President Biden begins that journey, just pick up on a couple of the thoughts that Mark was mentioning there. I mean, the next NATO Secretary-General was a piece of contention between the two groups, but that seems to have been resolved now. But do you think it could still come up?
I'm not sure it will necessarily come up formally in discussions between the two men, but I think it's right to say that there's maybe a sort of bad taste left in the mouths of some on the UK side. We've had people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, backbenchers that are not necessarily a fan of Rishi Sunak either, talking about the decayed state of the special relationship. There's also some concern, I think, about President Biden's green agenda in terms of the amount of money he's putting into quite protectionist measures to further US green tech. I think some on the UK side within the party, the Conservative Party, concerned about that. I'm not sure, though, that these are things that will necessarily come up as substantive disagreements, though. As Mark was saying, I think both sides eager to play down any chance of a spat on this occasion.
No, it's such a short visit. They won't want to have a falling out before both of them head off to Vilnius for that NATO Leaders Summit. We are looking at live pictures now from Stansted Airport. President Biden has arrived in the UK for a quick stop before going on to Vilnius in Lithuania for a NATO leaders meeting. He is going to spend the evening at Winfield House in Regent's Park, the residence of the US ambassador, before tomorrow morning having a meeting with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Plenty on the agenda for those two men to talk about. This will be another meeting. They've already met 6 times recently. And then President Biden will be meeting the King at Windsor Castle. President Biden arriving in the UK for his visit. It is 10 o'clock. You are watching Sky News at 10. President Joe Biden has arrived in the United Kingdom. That is Marine One at Stansted Airport. President Biden is here for a meeting with the Prime Minister and with the King before President Biden goes to a NATO leaders meeting in Vilnius. There is plenty on the agenda for his discussion with the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. The two men met recently in Washington, D.C., where the Atlantic Declaration was agreed to, a wide-ranging agreement with a number of elements in terms of trade and deals over business relations and the green agenda. And also, later in the day, tomorrow, President Biden will be meeting the King. It'll be the first meeting between President Joe Biden and King Charles since King Charles was crowned. As we watch Marine One begin its taxi, a short hop from Stansted Airport across London to northwest London to the US ambassador's residence. Our US correspondent Mark Stone is standing by for us. And Mark, we've sort of touched on many of the issues we think that may well come up between the two men, President Biden and Prime Minister Sunak, when they eventually meet. But of course, this is just, I guess, for President Biden, a stopover, because there is a very substantive and important NATO leaders meeting in Lithuania that he's in Europe for later in the week.
Yes, it's an alignment of schedules. I mean, the King had invited the President for a visit. It's not an official state visit, and they worked out that it was worthwhile doing it now on the way to Vilnius to the summit, the annual summit, which is taking place later on this week. So I think at Downing Street, the morning meeting with Rishi Sunak, there will be a predominant focus on Ukraine, on the issue of Ukraine, the decision to send cluster munitions by the Americans to Ukraine, the membership of Ukraine to NATO, the membership of Sweden to NATO as well. These will be key issues that will be discussed tomorrow at Downing Street, and then as 31 countries, they will be discussed at the NATO summit as well. So there is an awful lot of discussion that will take place on an awful lot of different issues. As the war enters, I think it's 500th day now, there is a sense of stalemate on the eastern battlefields of Ukraine, a sense that the counter-offensive by Ukraine, the so-called spring offensive, is, if not struggling, then certainly slow. There was a hope, if not an expectation, that it would be quicker. There is a shortage of ammunition. I was struck by how candid President Biden was in an interview today on CNN before going to London. He was clear that Ukraine is fast running out of artillery. The stocks back here in the United States, we've been to factories where we've seen them making ammunition. They too are running out, and so there needs to be a real focusing of minds. And I think the US president will once again try and persuade other NATO countries to provide more weaponry. The Americans have provided tranche after tranche of weapons to Ukraine. Other countries, Britain is second, I think, to the US in providing weaponry, but other countries are not doing as much as the Americans and the British would like them to. So the Americans and the British are at one on that issue. They may have differences over other issues. They're at one on that, and I think one effort will be to persuade other NATO countries to provide more weaponry as this war goes on and on, to break the stalemate and to push Russia back out of Ukrainian territory. I mentioned the membership of Sweden to NATO. That is very, very important. It's something that most NATO countries would like to see happen immediately. It's being held up by Turkey, who have issues over Sweden's view on Turkish separatists, the Kurdish separatists in Turkey. So that's an issue. The Hungarians have an issue with Swedish membership to NATO as well. So that needs to be ironed out. The expectation, and from conversations I've had, that will probably be ironed out. The other bigger issue is membership of Ukraine to NATO down the line. That won't happen now because Ukraine does not at the moment meet the criteria to be a NATO member. And also, if it was to become a NATO member now, it would create huge complications because it would effectively invoke Article 5 of NATO, which is if one country is attacked, then all of them are attacked. Well, Ukraine is already being attacked, so they can't bring Ukraine into NATO now. But I think we will get a form of language, a communique as it's known, a statement of intent that yes, NATO, Ukraine should be part of NATO at some point after the war has come to an end.